The Ghost Detective's Final Case, a shocking twist you won't believe. Chapter 1, The Last Case. The city breathed beneath a curtain of perpetual rain. Cold mist clinging to every building and alleyway like a ghost that refused to let go. It was the kind of weather that made everything feel heavy, as if the air itself carried the weight of unspoken sorrows. Detective Marcus Hale stood at the edge of the street, his eyes narrowed against the drizzle, his trench coat pulled tight against his tall frame. His face, worn by years of chasing shadows and criminals alike, reflected the weariness of a man who had long since lost count of the days he spent hunting the darkest elements of society. But tonight, the stakes felt different. The case that had haunted him for months, the Shadow Killer, was no ordinary investigation. Whoever the murderer was, they had made it personal, leaving taunting clues, mocking both the victims and the police who sought to stop the killing spree. Marcus had chased ghosts before. This was different. The Shadow Killer was a phantom in his own right, a predator who seemed to strike at will, slipping through the cracks of the city without leaving a trace. And for Marcus, this case had become more than just another file in the precinct. It was an obsession that had consumed him, gnawing at his every thought, stealing his sleep and gnawing at his sanity. His phone buzzed, jarring him from his thoughts. It was a message from Detective Sarah Cole, his partner, sharp, determined, and one of the few people he still trusted. Got a lead, warehouse on 9th. Looks promising. Be careful. Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. Sarah had been his rock during these last few months, her steady presence a counterbalance to the storm that raged inside him. He trusted her instincts, and tonight was no exception. If she believed this lead was solid, then it was worth pursuing. He slipped his phone back into his coat pocket and set off toward the warehouse district, his footsteps echoing in the quiet streets, the sound swallowed by the rain. The warehouse loomed in the distance like a monolith, its decaying exterior a testament to the city's forgotten corners, places where danger thrived in the shadows. The windows were shattered, the doors rusted and half-hinged, as though the building itself had given up on keeping out the darkness. Marcus approached cautiously, every sense on alert, his breath fogged in the air as he slowed, his hand hovering near the holster at his side. The silence was unsettling. Even the steady patter of rain seemed to soften as he neared the entrance, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He pushed open the creaking door, the metallic groan echoing through the hollow space beyond. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates and forgotten machinery, the faint glow of streetlights outside casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Marcus moved through the space like a predator himself, careful and calculating. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts in situations like this, when danger seemed to linger just beyond the edge of perception. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he wove between the stacks of crates, his hand tight on his gun. Something wasn't right. The air felt wrong, too still, too expectant. And then he heard it. A faint sound, barely more than a whisper. Footsteps. He spun, gun drawn, but there was no one there. Just shadows, flickering and shifting in the corners of his vision. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. It was too early to jump at phantoms. He had been through worse, much worse. But tonight, something gnawed at the back of his mind, a sense of impending doom that he couldn't shake. The footsteps came again, closer this time, and this time he was ready. He moved toward the sound, his muscles tensed, every nerve on fire. But as he rounded the corner of a towering stack of crates, the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. Suddenly, pain exploded in the back of his head, a sharp, blinding force that sent him sprawling to the ground. His vision blurred as his skull cracked against the cold concrete. Stars danced in his eyes, and he struggled to stay conscious, the world tilting and spinning around him. Through the haze of pain, he saw a figure step into view, tall, shrouded in a long coat, face hidden in the shadows, the Shadow Killer. Marcus tried to move, to lift his gun, but his body betrayed him. His limbs felt like lead, his strength drained by the brutal blow. A figure crouched beside him, and for a moment Marcus thought he saw a smile, cold, cruel, and victorious. "You were close," the figure whispered, their voice like ice sending a chill down Marcus's spine. "But not close enough." As the darkness closed in, Marcus felt the last shreds of his consciousness slipping away. His mind raced, desperate to hold on, to fight back, but the cold grip of death was stronger than his will. His last thought, before the world went black, was of Sarah. Sarah, who would have to pick up the pieces of the case he had left unfinished. The rain had not let up by the time they buried Marcus Hale. Detective Sarah Cole stood at the edge of the cemetery, coat soaked through, her eyes fixed on the freshly turned earth. She had never imagined this day would come. Not like this. Not so soon. Marcus had been more than just her partner. He had been her mentor, friend, person who had shown her the ropes when she first joined the force. And now, he was gone, taken by the very case that had consumed his life. The funeral was a somber affair. Few words were spoken, and even fewer people attended. Marcus had never been one for socializing, and in the end, it seemed his relentless pursuit of justice had left him more isolated than ever. Sarah remained after the others had gone, standing in silence as the rain washed away the last traces of the ceremony. She didn't cry. Marcus would have hated that. "I'll find him," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I swear to you, Marcus, I'll finish what you started." As she turned to leave, a single flash of lightning lit up the cemetery, casting long shadows across the graves. And for a moment, just a moment, Sarah thought she saw a figure standing in the distance, watching her from beneath a dark hood. When she blinked, the figure was gone. Only the rain remained, falling steadily over the city, washing away the sins of the dead. Chapter 2: Ghost in the Mirror. Marcus Hale awoke to a peculiar silence, one that was too complete, too empty. For a moment he simply lay there, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling above his bed, the ones he'd often contemplated during long, sleepless nights. The rain outside still beat softly against the window, a rhythm he had known for years. Something was wrong. Something off. He sat up slowly, his body feeling unusually light, as if the weariness that had hung over him for months had vanished overnight. Ache in his bones, the heaviness in his muscles, gone. Confusion settled in, thick and unsettling. Had he been dreaming? He vaguely remembered pain, darkness, a voice, the warehouse. His mind latched onto the memory and like a jolt of alt came rushing back. The warehouse, the shadow killer, the ambush. He had died. Marcus shot to his feet, heart pounding in his chest, only to realize that there was no heartbeat at all. He raised a hand to his chest. The familiar thrum of life was absent. Panic surged through him as he looked around the apartment. His apartment, the one he had lived in for years. Creaky wooden floors, the cluttered desk covered in case files, the dusty bookshelves. It was all just as he had left it. Something about the air felt different, heavier. He moved toward the bathroom, each step slow and hesitant, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, turn around, but he couldn't. There was an inexplicable pull, a magnetic force guiding him forward, dragging him toward the truth he wasn't ready to face. In the mirror above the sink, the reflection that greeted him was not his own. His breath caught, though there was no breath to be had, as he stared at the figure in the glass. It was him, and yet, not. The face was the same, rugged, weathered by years of chasing criminals and sleepless nights. The hair, the square jaw, even the tired eyes, they were his. But there was something else, something unmistakably wrong. His skin had taken on an unnatural pallor, almost translucent, with a faint, eerie glow emanating from beneath the surface. And his eyes, once sharp, now dull and hollow, seemed to gaze back at him from another world. Marcus took a step back, his mind racing. His hands, trembling, reached toward the mirror, hoping against hope that he was imagining things. But when his fingers brushed against the cold glass, the reflection did not change. His touch left no mark, no smudge. It was as if the mirror no longer acknowledged his presence. He wasn't alive. The realization crashed down on him like a tidal wave, pulling him under its relentless current. He was dead, gone. And yet, somehow, here, trapped in this in-between, a ghost tethered to a world that no longer saw him. Marcus staggered back, his legs giving out beneath him as he crumpled to the floor, the weight of his death finally sinking in. Memories of that night at the warehouse flooded his mind. Killer, the ambush, the searing pain in his head. And then, nothing. He had died, and now he was left to wander in the remnants of his life. phantom in his own city. For what felt like hours, he sat there on the cold bathroom floor, his mind spinning. Was this it? Was this what came after death? An endless, empty existence, watching the living world pass him by? He wasn't sure how much time had passed when the sound of footsteps jolted him from his thoughts. His senses, now attuned to something beyond the mortal realm, picked up the soft thud of boots on the wooden floor in the next room. Marcus's head snapped up. Someone was in his apartment. For a fleeting moment, hope flared in his chest, a distant, irrational hope that perhaps somehow he was still alive. But as he drifted into the living room, his heart, or whatever was left of it, sank. It was Sarah. She stood in the middle of the room, her back to him, staring at the cluttered desk. His desk. She looked different. The sharpness in her posture was gone, replaced by something softer, more fragile. Her shoulders slumped, and her usually confident stance seemed weighed down by an invisible burden. She reached out and picked up one of his old case files, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through it. Marcus watched in silence, a wave of grief washing over him as he realized she was standing in his apartment, grieving for him. He tried to speak, call out her name, but the words died in his throat. His voice no longer carried weight in this world. He was a ghost, and she couldn't hear him. Sarah moved through the apartment, her movements slow, deliberate. She picked up small objects, his badge, his notebook, each one a relic of a life that had been violently ripped away. And as she stood there in the quiet, she whispered softly, her voice breaking, "I'm sorry, Marcus. I should have been there." Marcus wanted to reach out, to tell her it wasn't her fault. He wanted to scream, to grab her shoulders and shake her out of the grief that weighed her down. But all he could do was watch, helpless, as Sarah sank into his old armchair, her head in her hands, the weight of the world resting on her shoulders. In that moment, Marcus knew he couldn't let go. He couldn't move on. Not yet. The shadow killer was still out there, and Marcus couldn't rest until the case was solved. His death hadn't ended the investigation. It had only made it more urgent. As the hours passed, Marcus tried everything he could think of to reach Sarah. He moved objects, knocked over a stack of books, even slammed his fist against the wall, but nothing worked. She remained oblivious to his presence, lost in her own thoughts, haunted by the memory of him. Frustrated, Marcus drifted through the apartment, searching for any clue, any sign that could help him understand why he was still here. He was tethered to this world for a reason, and he was determined to find out why. As he moved through the familiar spaces of his old life, memories began to surface. Snatches of conversations, flashes of moments long gone. But none of it made sense. He couldn't piece together the puzzle. The memory of his death remained fragmented, elusive, like a nightmare that refused to fade. In his frustration, Marcus found himself staring once again at the mirror in the bathroom. The reflection that stared back at him now seemed almost mocking. Constant reminder of what he had lost. Clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath the surface. There had to be a way to make things right. Couldn't spend eternity like this, a ghost in the ruins of his own life. And then, just as he was about to turn away, he saw it. A flicker of movement in the mirror. A shadow. No, not a shadow. A figure standing just beyond his reflection, watching him. Marcus froze, his eyes widening. It wasn't his imagination. The figure was real, the dark silhouette barely visible in the dim light. And as he stared, the figure began to take shape, a face, half hidden in shadow, eyes glinting with cold amusement. The shadow killer. Marcus felt a chill crawl down his spine, his newfound ghostly form tingling with an unfamiliar sensation. Fear. The figure smirked, its lips curling into a sinister smile. "You didn't think it was over, did you?" it whispered, the words echoing in Marcus's mind. And just like that, the figure vanished, leaving Marcus staring at his own reflection once more, haunted, alone, and more determined than ever. Case wasn't over. Not yet. Chapter 3: Whispers from Beyond. City's streets were slick with rain, casting reflections of distant neon lights that flickered like ghosts in the water. Marcus Hale drifted along the familiar roads, a specter moving through a world he no longer belonged to. Cold, biting wind passed through him, leaving no sensation but an eerie emptiness that gnawed at his very essence. Days, weeks perhaps, had passed since he first awoke to his new, unsettling reality, and still, He remained bound to the scenes of his former life. Sarah had been relentless since his death. He watched as she combed through every crime scene linked to the shadow killer, following leads, questioning witnesses, and chasing down dead ends. Her determination matched his own, yet she was alone in this fight, burdened by grief and guilt. Marcus ached to help her, to scream at her that he was still here, watching, desperate to guide her to the truth. But he couldn't. He was no longer a man of flesh and blood, bound by the rules of the living. His hands could no longer grasp. His voice couldn't pierce the air. He was nothing more than a ripple in the fabric of existence, a ghost who could not touch the world he had once fought to protect. It was maddening. Yet over time, Marcus had learned something. Though he could not interact with the world in the ways he once could, there were small things, little manipulations like whispers carried on the wind, or the faintest flicker of light, just enough to nudge someone's attention. It wasn't much, but it was something. He wasn't completely powerless. His first attempt had been cautious. Flicker of motion out of the corner of Sarah's eye as she pored over case files late into the night. She had looked up, her brow furrowed, but dismissed it as exhaustion. The second time, he had caused a faint whisper to drift through the room, almost imperceptible, yet just enough to make her pause. She had glanced around, sensing something, someone, but still, she hadn't understood. Now Marcus followed her like a shadow, silent companion as she moved from one scene to the next. He hovered at the edges of her awareness, watching, waiting for the right moment to send her a sign. Tonight, she was at the alley where the latest victim had been found, a young woman, her life snuffed out just like all the others. The scene was grim. Darkened alleyway steeped in the smell of rain and decay. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, marking the boundaries of the unspeakable horror that had unfolded. Sarah stood in the center of the alley, face pale, her eyes hollow as she examined the scene. Marcus floated just behind her, studying the ground. Something about this place felt familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. There was a nagging sensation, an unfinished thought gnawing at the corners of his mind. He had been close to something before he died, close to uncovering the truth. But what was it? He moved closer to the wall, where the damp brick seemed to glisten under the streetlight. And then he saw it, a faint mark etched into the stone, almost invisible to the naked eye. Marcus leaned in, his ghostly form blending with the shadows. It was a symbol, a crude drawing of an eye, scrawled in haste. He recognized it immediately. It had been carved into the walls at the warehouse the night he died. His chest tightened, or at least it would have if he were still human. He had to make Sarah see it. She needed to know. He focused all his will, pushing his energy toward the bricks, willing the symbol to catch her attention. Slowly, the light from the street lamp flickered, dimming just enough to cast a faint shadow over the mark. Sarah paused, glancing at the wall. For a moment, she hesitated, her gaze drawn to the spot where Marcus was focused. He willed her to look closer, to step forward and see what he couldn't tell her. Her eyes narrowed, and then, as if driven by some instinct, she moved toward the wall. She ran her fingers over the rough surface, stopping just above the symbol. Her breath caught. "What the hell?" she whispered, tracing the outline of the eye with her fingertips. Marcus felt a surge of hope. She saw it. She knew. Before he could celebrate, a chilling thought crept into his mind. Why had the killer left the symbol here? How could the shadow killer have known Marcus would return to this scene? The realization hit him like a hammer blow. Killer knew. Somehow the shadow killer was aware of his presence. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message, left deliberately for him to find. Marcus recoiled, his form flickering as his mind raced. How could that be possible? How could the killer know he was still watching, still trying to solve the case? He followed Sarah as she pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the symbol, her mind clearly spinning with questions. She didn't know what it meant, but Marcus could see the determination hardening in her eyes. She would follow this lead, no matter where it took her. And he would be there, guiding her in whatever way he could. For the next several nights, Marcus watched as Sarah dug deeper into the investigation. She visited the homes of victims, combing through evidence, speaking with their families, and piecing together connections Marcus had missed in life. Everywhere they went, The same unsettling pattern emerged. The killer was always one step ahead, leaving behind subtle hints that seemed to mock them both. One night, while Sarah was poring over files in her apartment, Marcus found himself drawn to an old case note he had written months ago. It was crumpled, buried beneath piles of more recent documents. But something about it felt important. He focused all his energy, causing the paper to shift slightly, sliding it across the desk toward Sarah. She noticed the movement and, with a frown, picked up the note. It was from an interview Marcus had conducted with a witness who had seen someone lurking near the warehouse just days before his death. At the time, it had seemed like a dead end, the description too vague to follow up on. But now, with the symbol freshly etched in her mind, Sarah saw the connection. The witness had mentioned seeing the same eye symbol, drawn hastily on a notebook the suspect had been carrying. Marcus's mind raced. He remembered now. He had been investigating that very lead the night he was killed. It was no coincidence. The killer had been close, closer than he had realized, and now they were playing a deadly game, leaving clues for Sarah to find, knowing that Marcus was watching every step. As Sarah grabbed her coat and prepared to leave, Marcus followed her into the night, the rain falling in heavy sheets around them. The city was alive with shadows, and Marcus could feel the weight of something sinister lurking just beyond the edges of their investigation. He had been pulled into this mystery, not just as a victim, but as a pawn in a larger, more twisted game. And the killer was watching, waiting. But Marcus wasn't done. Not yet. He had found a way to communicate, to influence the living world, even if it was just whispers and fleeting shadows. It was enough. He would guide Sarah, protect her, and together they would finish what he had started. But as they closed in on their next lead, chilling realization began to settle in Marcus's mind. The killer wasn't just taunting them. The killer wanted Marcus to keep watching. The trap was already set. Chapter 4. The Truth Unveiled. The rain had stopped, leaving the city cloaked in a misty haze that hovered low over the streets. The air smelled of damp asphalt and decay, as if the world itself was rotting from the inside out. Sarah drove through the winding streets, her knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel. She was headed toward the home of a man Marcus had known well, a once reliable informant who had vanished from the radar months ago. This was her new lead, the one Marcus had pointed her toward with his subtle, ghostly nudges. Sarah wasn't certain what she would find when she got there, but something in her gut told her this was it. She could feel it in the hollow pit of her stomach, the same sensation she always got when she was on the verge of uncovering something crucial. And this time, it was personal. Every step she had taken since Marcus's death had led her here, to this moment where answers waited to be ripped from the shadows. Marcus floated beside her, invisible and silent as always, but his thoughts were a whirlwind of chaos. He had pieced together parts of the puzzle, though the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. The killer knew him, intimately. Every victim had been chosen with precision, their lives connected to Marcus in ways that he had failed to recognize in life. He should have seen it. He should have known, and now he was about to learn just how deep the rabbit hole went. Sarah pulled up in front of a rundown house, its windows boarded up, paint peeling from the walls like dead skin. The place reeked of neglect, as if it had been forgotten by the world. She hesitated for a moment, eyeing the darkened windows, her hand instinctively moving toward the gun holstered at her side. Marcus could see the tension in her posture, fear she wouldn't admit to, but she steeled herself and stepped out of the car. The house loomed over her as she approached, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the fog. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the gutters. Marcus floated closer, his eyes fixed on the front door. This place was familiar, too familiar. Memories flickered in his mind like disjointed fragments of a dream, and for a moment he wondered if he had been here before. Sarah knocked, the sound echoing hollowly in the stillness. There was no response. She knocked again, more forcefully this time, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open a few inches. A man stood in the doorway, his face half hidden in the gloom. He was gaunt, his skin pale and sickly, with eyes that darted nervously over Sarah as if she were a threat he hadn't expected. "Detective Cole?" His voice was thin, barely more than a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "I'm looking for information about the shadow killer," he said, her voice firm. "You used to work with Marcus Hale. I need answers." The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be watching. Marcus floated closer, studying the man's face, and suddenly, it all came flooding back. His name was Alan Klein, a small-time crook turned informant who had fed Marcus intel for years. But something was different about him now. He looked haunted, as if he had seen too much, known too much, and it had driven him to the brink. "Come inside," Klein muttered, stepping aside to let Sarah in. His eyes flickered to the shadows, a nervous tick Marcus had seen before. The man was afraid. Sarah entered cautiously, her hand still resting on her weapon. The inside of the house was even worse than the outside. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the stench of mildew. Papers were scattered across the floor, and the walls were lined with photographs, newspaper clippings, and hastily scribbled notes. It looked like a conspiracy theorist's lair, and Sarah's eyes immediately went to the pictures on the wall. Marcus's stomach twisted as he saw them. The photographs weren't just random. Every one of them was connected to the victims of the shadow killer. Faces he recognized, people whose deaths he had investigated, all pinned up in a macabre display of connection. But what chilled him to the core was the realization that among the faces, there were others. People from his own life. Old friends, former colleagues, even estranged family members. The killer hadn't been targeting random victims. They had been targeting Marcus's past, tearing apart the fabric of his life piece by piece. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice low, filled with a barely restrained edge of horror. He stepped closer to the wall, her fingers brushing over one of the photographs. It was a picture of a woman, an old girlfriend of Marcus's from years ago, someone he had lost contact with long before his career as a detective had even begun. Klein shuffled nervously behind her, wringing his hands. "I don't know everything," he said, his voice trembling. "But I know that this isn't about just the victims. It's about Hale. It's always been about Hale." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes dark and intense. "What are you saying?" Klein swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the door as if he were afraid someone might burst in at any moment. "The shadow killer. He's been following Marcus for years, even before the murder started. He knew things about Marcus, about his past, things no one should have known." Marcus floated closer, his mind racing. He had been chasing the killer for months, obsessed with finding them. But all the while, killer had been watching him, toying with him. Every death, every clue had been part of a sick game, one designed to draw him closer and closer to the edge. Sarah's expression hardened. "Who is he?" she demanded. "How does he know about Marcus?" Klein shook his head, his hands trembling. "I don't know his real name," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I know he's someone from Marcus's past, someone Marcus wronged." Marcus recoiled as the words hit him. Someone from his past? His mind raced through the possibilities, trying to piece together the fragments of memory. He had made enemies over the years, plenty of them, but none who would go to these lengths, none who would destroy so many lives just to get to him. Sarah stepped forward, grabbing Klein by the arm. "You need to tell me everything you know," she said, her voice cold and deadly serious. "Now." Klein's eyes flickered with fear. "He's been planning this for a long time," he stammered. "The murders, they were just the beginning. He wanted Marcus to suffer, to watch everything he cared about unravel. And now that Marcus is gone, he's coming for you." Marcus felt a chill run through him, though he no longer had a body to feel the cold. Killer wasn't done, not by a long shot. And now, Sarah was in his sights. As Klein rambled, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen, and her face went pale. "Another body," she muttered, her voice tight with tension. Marcus followed her gaze to the phone, and his heart, if he still had one, dropped. The location of the newest victim was too familiar. It was the same street where Marcus had grown up, a place where his childhood memories lingered like ghosts of their own. The killer had drawn them there, to the very heart of Marcus's past, and there was no doubt in Marcus's mind that this time it was personal. Sarah didn't waste a second. She turned on her heel, storming out of the house and into the night, leaving Klein trembling in the doorway. Marcus followed her, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and rage. Whoever the killer was, they had been manipulating him from the very beginning, and now they were targeting the one person left in his life who still mattered. As Sarah sped through the city streets, Marcus' mind raced. He had been blind, too focused on the case to see the truth right in front of him. Now, killer was closing in, their trap almost complete. But this time, Marcus wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't just a pawn in the killer's game anymore. He was going to stop them, whatever it took. The truth had been unveiled, and now the real fight was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Final Confrontation. The air was thick with tension as Sarah stepped out of her car. Isolated warehouse looming in front of her, like a dark monolith. A sense of foreboding clung to her skin, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. The location was miles from the city, far removed from prying eyes. It was too perfect, too calculated. She knew she was walking into a trap, just as Marcus had before her. But this time, she had one thing on her side that Marcus hadn't: him. Marcus drifted through the shadows beside her, invisible but ever watchful. His presence, though intangible, was a force Sarah could almost feel now. He had been with her through every twist, every revelation, guiding her in ways she barely understood. But here, at this moment, he knew his role was more crucial than ever. Killer was waiting, and they had set the stage for a final, deadly act. As Sarah approached the warehouse, the cold night air cut through her jacket, her breath visible in the dim light. Her hand hovered near her gun, the weight of it a small comfort, though she knew it wouldn't be enough. This killer wasn't just another criminal. They were something far worse. Someone with intimate knowledge of her and Marcus. Someone who had woven this intricate web of violence with deliberate precision. The doors to the warehouse creaked open on rusted hinges as she entered, footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The interior was vast and empty, the walls lined with crates and forgotten debris. A single flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, wavering shadows that danced eerily around her. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint drip of water, slow and rhythmic, as if the building itself was counting down to something inevitable. Marcus floated beside her, his gaze scanning every corner, every darkened space where danger might lurk. He could feel it. Presence. The killer was here, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. His anger boiled beneath the surface, cold fury that had only grown as the truth unraveled. This wasn't just about the murders, the victims. It was personal, a vendetta that had been years in the making, and now the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Sarah. Marcus's whisper, barely more than a breeze, carried through the air. He couldn't speak to her directly, but he willed her to be alert, to sense the trap closing around her. He had seen the killer's handiwork too many times to believe they would make a simple mistake now. Everything was orchestrated for maximum effect. Sarah was a pawn in a game she barely understood, but Marcus was determined to give her the advantage he hadn't had. Sarah moved deeper into the warehouse, her eyes sharp and focused, scanning every shadow. Her instincts, owned over years of police work, were on high alert. She could feel it, the heavy weight of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. Her heartbeat quickened, the hairs on the back of her neck rising. She paused, drawing her gun from its holster, and took a deep breath. Then a noise, soft, barely audible but unmistakable. Scuff of a shoe against the floor, the sound of someone shifting their weight. She spun toward the source, her weapon raised, her finger hovering over the trigger. "Come out," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. "It's over. I know who you are." The silence that followed was suffocating, stretching out into an unbearable tension. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, lean, dressed in dark clothing that blended into the gloom. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped into the flickering light and she saw their face. It was a man, one she recognized immediately. Detective Eric Larson. Her heart sank as she took in the familiar features of her former colleague. A man she had once trusted, just as Marcus had. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This was the person behind it all. This was the shadow killer. "Eric, do you breathe?" disbelief warring with the horror in her chest. "You?" Eric's lips twisted into a cruel smile, his eyes gleaming with a sick satisfaction. "Surprised, Sarah? You shouldn't be. Marcus always thought he was so clever, always a step ahead. But he never saw me coming. None of you did." Sarah's grip tightened on her gun. "Why?" she demanded, her voice hardening. "Why do this? Why kill all those people?" Eric's smile widened, a madness flickering in his gaze. "Because he deserved it. Marcus, he betrayed me, just like everyone else. We were partners, Sarah. We were supposed to watch each other's backs. But then he started his rise, leaving me in the shadows. I was nothing to him. Less than nothing." Marcus listened, his spectral form hovering just out of reach, fury coiling inside him like a venomous snake. Larson had been his partner once, a fellow officer he had trusted, confided in. He had never seen the jealousy festering beneath the surface, quiet resentment that had grown into something far more dangerous. And now Marcus was dead because of it. "He didn't betray you," Era snapped, her voice rising. "He was trying to do his job. You could have been a part of that. You were a part of it. But this? You think this is justice?" Eric's eyes narrowed, his smile fading. "Justice? No, Sarah, this isn't about justice. This is about revenge. This is about taking back what was mine. Marcus took everything from me, my career, my reputation, my life, so I took something from him." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the full extent of Eric's twisted reasoning. This wasn't just about Marcus's death. It was about the slow, methodical destruction of everything Marcus had ever cared about. His friends, his family, his legacy. Eric took a step closer, his hand hovering near his waist, and Sarah's instincts screamed at her. She raised her gun, her finger on the trigger, but before she could react, Marcus acted. All the energy he could muster, Marcus reached out into the physical world. His form flickered, wavering between the realms of the living and the dead. But he focused, pushing harder than he ever had before. He couldn't touch Eric, couldn't stop him directly, but he could manipulate the environment, just enough. Flickering light above them sparked and burst, plunging the warehouse into darkness. In the sudden confusion, Eric moved, drawing a knife from his belt, his eyes gleaming with murderous intent. But before he could lunge at Sarah, Marcus caused a stack of crates to shift, tumbling down with a deafening crash. Eric stumbled, caught off guard by the sudden noise, and in that split second, Sarah fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the empty space, and Eric collapsed to the ground, clutching his side in pain. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading across the cold concrete. Breathing heavily, Sarah stepped closer, keeping her gun trained on him. "It's over," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Eric laughed, bitter, choking sound. "Over? It's never over, Sarah. You think this changes anything? I took everything from him. You're just a footnote in his story." But as the life drained from Eric's eyes, Marcus knew the truth. This was his final act, the last piece of the puzzle falling into place. Larson had been consumed by jealousy and rage, and in the end, it had destroyed him. Marcus had tried to stop it, to save those he cared about. But in the end, his greatest mistake had been trusting the wrong person. As the last breath left Eric's body, Marcus felt a strange peace settle over him. He had done what he could. He had guided Sarah, protected her, and in the end, ensured that justice had been served. Sarah stood over the lifeless body of Eric Larson, her gun still clenched in her hand. The warehouse was silent once more, the echoes of the confrontation fading into the night. She knew that Marcus was there somewhere, watching over her, and though she couldn't see him, she whispered softly into the darkness, "Thank you." Marcus lingered for a moment longer, the weight of his unfinished business finally lifting. He had found redemption, not in his life, but in his death. And with that, he faded, leaving Sarah to face the world without him. But he knew she would be all right. She was strong, stronger than he had ever been. And now, she had the truth. The final confrontation was over, and Marcus Hale could finally rest. Chapter 6. Rest in Peace. The city outside Sarah's apartment was bathed in the soft glow of dawn, first light breaking through the heavy clouds of the night. Morning was tranquil, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that had raged within these walls only hours before. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, her face pale and tired, but her eyes held a newfound determination. The murder of Detective Marcus Hale had been solved. The shadow that had loomed over her life now lifted. Yet the scars of the ordeal ran deep, marking both her heart and the city she vowed to protect. Marcus Hale watched from the doorway of Sarah's apartment, his form a gentle shimmer in the early light. His gaze was fixed on Sarah, his former partner who had shown incredible strength and resolve. He had seen through the deception, faced the darkness head-on, and emerged victorious. For all that Marcus had achieved in his final act, it was her courage and dedication truly resonated with. The room was filled with the quiet hum of the city's awakening, a soothing backdrop to Marcus's contemplative silence. He had witnessed Sarah's struggle, her sleepless nights, and the moments of raw vulnerability as she wrestled with the weight of the case. Now, as she sat in the aftermath, the relief and exhaustion were evident. The killer was gone, but the journey had left its mark on her. Marcus drifted closer, his ethereal form intertwining with the light that filtered through the windows. He watched her as she placed a framed photograph on the table. Picture of him, smiling and full of life, a memory of better days. Her fingers lingered on the frame, a silent tribute to the friend she had lost and the justice she had fought for. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but there was also a glimmer of peace. The nightmare was over, and though the wound was fresh, healing had begun. With the case resolved, Marcus felt the heavy shroud of unresolved business beginning to lift. For the first time since his death, he experienced a sense of clarity and calm. The specter of obsession that had driven him in life now dissolved, leaving behind a profound realization of what he had sacrificed in the pursuit of justice. His relentless quest for truth had come at a cost. The loss of personal connections and the alienation from those who cared about him. People he had left behind had become shadows in his single-minded pursuit, their voices drowned out by his own desperation. As he stood by Sarah, he reflected on his life, choices he had made, and the unintended consequences of his action. He saw the moments he had missed, family gatherings, quiet evenings spent with friends, and the simple joys of life that he had forsaken for the sake of his duty. His obsession had been both his strength and his undoing, a double-edged sword that had blinded him to the warmth of human connection. It was a hard lesson to learn, one that he could only grasp now from beyond the veil of death. In the stillness of the apartment, Marcus sensed a shift in the air, a gentle pull toward the light that beckoned from the edges of his awareness. The afterlife was calling, but it wasn't the end he had anticipated. There was an unspoken promise of something beyond the eternal rest, a second chance at existence, but not in the way he had imagined. The mysteries of the afterlife were far more complex than he had ever understood, and his journey was far from over. As the sun's rays grew stronger, bathing the room in a warm golden glow, Marcus felt a soothing embrace, a gentle nudge from the universe itself. The light was inviting, not merely an end, but a transformation, a new beginning. His form began to fade, the edges of his spectral presence blurring as he moved closer to the light. It was a promise of redemption and renewal, a chance to mend the broken threads of his existence in a realm beyond mortal understanding. He took one last look at Sarah, his final act of farewell. She was his legacy, his reminder of the human side of justice. He had watched her grow, seen her courage, and admired her unwavering spirit. He was leaving her with more than just a solved case. He was leaving her with the strength to continue, the wisdom to see beyond the darkness, and the hope for a brighter future. Sarah? His voice was a soft whisper, carried on the wind. Thank you. With those final words, Marcus Hale vanished into the light, his form dissolving into the brilliance that awaited him. The light enveloped him, a gentle embrace that promised peace and a new beginning. The weight of his past faded away, placed by the promise of something greater, a second chance, a new purpose. Sarah remained by the table, her eyes closed, feeling a strange sense of closure and comfort. The apartment was quiet once more, but it was different, less heavy, less burdened. The case was over, and Marcus's spirit had found its rest. The sun's rays continued to warm the room, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the light. As Sarah opened her eyes, she looked at the photograph of Marcus with a bittersweet smile. The journey had been arduous, the price high, but justice had prevailed. Marcus had found his redemption, and in doing so, left her with a powerful lesson. The final twist of Marcus's journey, promise of a second chance in a way he never expected, left Sarah with much to ponder. Pursuit of justice had its costs, but it also held the potential for profound transformation. The afterlife was not an end, but a passage, a chance to make things right in ways that transcended mortal understanding. As she sat in the quiet of her apartment, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was ready to face the future, to honor Marcus's memory, and to continue the work they had started together. Shadows of the past were behind her, and the light of a new beginning stretched out before her. Marcus Hale had found his rest, but his legacy lived on. Consequences of seeking justice at any cost, clear. But so was the enduring power of redemption and the hope for a brighter tomorrow. And with that, the story of the Phantom Detective came to a close, leaving readers to reflect on the true nature of justice, the cost of obsession, and the promise of redemption.